So our first keynote speaker is the director of the cybersecurity agency and in the Singapore government. And Singapore, as we said, a very connected place, connected through a lot of things, and is not just a financial services hub, but is a telecommunications, connectivity, and a business hub. But that comes with a need to be the safe place to do business in Asia. So particularly with API traffic making up about 80% of all internet traffic, it's a very important topic to make sure that we stay we can safely do business in this environment. So I'm very pleased to welcome Veronica.
Hi everyone, nice being here today. If I could just put my slides up. Okay, today's topic, I wanted to thank John for the great introduction and overview because this is me here coming to set the stage about the digital economy, how to exploit the opportunities, and in doing so, we need to be mindful about staying cyber safe. So just to recap, Singapore does have a bold vision to be a leading digital economy in the world. And earlier on, John talked about us as a trade hub and a hub for finance and so on. In the digital domain, we also want to be a trusted digital hub as well. Many of you in the room are API developers, ICT professionals, and I thought I would want to acknowledge the importance of having a trusted tech industry because you guys are cornerstone to Singapore being a trusted digital hub. Just a couple of statistics just to set the context of the importance of the ICT industry and tech professionals in general, digital professionals as well. Our digital economy employs about 200 over 1,000 ICT professionals. About half are in the ICT sector, but the other half of you are working in all the other sectors, trying to drive digital transformation and digital technologies. Now, when I talked about Singapore being a digital trusted hub, this is actually a huge word. And the question is, how does this actually translate into our day-to-day operations and what we do? And unsurprisingly, cybersecurity is actually at the heart of digital trust. So in this survey that I'm showing here and a couple of statistics, there have been interviews and surveys done with key practitioners, CIOs, and so on. And they tried to figure out what were some of the ingredients that made the digital leaders stand out from their peers and their competitors. And in this slide, we show that in this case, the digital leaders do outperform their competitors in customer trust, simply because they have embedded risk and security into the forefront of their IT project cycles. So I think what I'm trying to say is that earlier on, when I opened with a big vision to say that Singapore seeks to be a leading digital economy, a trusted digital hub, basically the ICT industry plays an important role. And I think in doing so, to foster that digital trust, cybersecurity is important to us. And it is with that in mind that CSA, the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore, has recently launched a cybersecurity certification for enterprises called CyberSafe and Cyber Essentials. So what does certification bring to organizations out there? When you are certified, it's basically a form of a visible indicator and a chalk for you to demonstrate that you have implemented specific cybersecurity practices. With that chalk, or so to speak, it basically helps you to build trust by providing assurance to your customers that you are cyber safe. And this in turn translates into a form of competitive edge for your business and helps you to differentiate from your competitors. Now, why do I say that this is actually important for gaining trust? I think for many of the cybersecurity professionals in the room, if you look at the trends in the past 2 years, we would have seen a major increase in supply chain attacks. And the statistics I'm showing here are taken off a report done by ENISA, a cybersecurity agency overseeing Europe. And they looked at some of the key drivers and the key motivations of supply chain attacks in the past 2 years. 66% of the attacks actually focus on the supplier's code, and 62% of the attacks exploit the trust of customers in their supplier. So what this means is that as supply chain attacks increasingly get more well known in the industry, for many of you who are developers, who are providers of technology, your customers may be aware of this and they may start asking, am I going to be exploited, not directly, but indirectly through my partnerships or through my third-party suppliers? So I think this is where it's important to demonstrate that you as a supplier have that brand of trust. I am probably preaching very much to the converted in the room here, but I just wanted to take a quick step back to look at how APIs has increased over the years. I would say about 5 to 6 years ago, we started to see words like the API economy make it into the mainstream. And basically, what I have on the slide is just an article from Forbes really talking about it. And fast forward to now, 5 to 6 years later, particularly the past 2 years, where COVID has accelerated the pace of digitalization, many have embraced digital transactions. And in order to have digital transactions, APIs are important. So we have seen a marked increase in API usage the past few years, and I would say very much particularly so in the last 2 years, accelerated by the COVID pandemic. So as API traffic grows, correspondingly, I think also unfortunately, while the opportunities are there, we also see an increase in malicious API traffic. And this is also why this is also timely and important to start thinking about cybersecurity and how, if you're a provider of APIs, how to basically generate that brand of trust. I just wanted to clarify at this point that the Cyber Trust and Cyber Essentials certification, now these are not product specific. For example, it is not specific to software development or APIs in general, but it looks at the whole organization in totality and the total posture of the organization from 3 perspectives: the people, the process, as well as the technology used. So my subsequent slides will explain a little bit about the differences between the marks, but just a broad high-level overview if you're thinking about what would be suitable from your perspective. I would like to offer 3 dimensions to think about. Number 1, the extent of digitalization. So if we look at the red bar moving from the left all the way to the right, essentially on the right-hand side, this will be reflective of organizations that are a lot more digital, which translates to a larger attack footprint for attackers, and which also means that you would need to put in place more cybersecurity measures in order to stay cyber safe. Likewise, the second perspective is from the nature of the industry that you're operating in, or if you're a provider, your customer is operating in. So again, if you move from the left all the way to the right, typically in the more regulated industries, there would be a stronger level of scrutiny, and that's where correspondingly important to also have more cybersecurity put in place. However, we're also mindful that this has to balance against the organizational resources, which brings me to the third dimension, which is the organizational profile. Now, organizations come in all shapes and sizes, and logically, we would have a few of the larger enterprises and many of the smaller enterprises. So for smaller enterprises that may not have the resources upfront to invest that much in cybersecurity, I think the Cyber Essentials mark could be relevant considerations. So what is a Cyber Essentials mark? It's really essentially a mark of cyber hygiene. And the idea is that we recognize that putting in place 100% security is going to be difficult and perhaps out of reach of many organizations. So if it is always to insist about 100% security, it may turn away organizations and they may not want to invest that much. So Cyber Essentials basically serves to prioritize the key measures that organizations would need to focus on first. So what it essentially translates to is a set of cyber hygiene measures that help enterprises to stay protected, well, not necessarily from everything, but from the majority of the current cyber attacks. And basically, there are 5 categories of measures. Number 1, assets from the perspective of your people, your hardware and software, as well as your data. Secondly, secure or protection measures, for example, virus and anti-malware, for example, secure configuration. Updating your software, backing your software up, especially in cases where ransomware attacks is also increasing in the industry. And finally, in terms of response, simply because investing in preventive measures, while good and useful, is not a guarantee that you do not stay attacked. So if attacks are not a matter of if but when, then important to also think about your incident response so that if an incident happens, you are able to respond quickly and recover quickly so that there's minimal impact on your business operations. So the Cyber Essentials mark is a form of a formal certification program. The validity of the certification is for a 2-year period, and we will have independent assessors in the form of certification bodies that will review the assessment, and this is done through a desktop assessment process. Now, if Cyber Essentials mark is about cyber hygiene, then Cyber Trust Mark is really targeted at organizations that have gone beyond cyber hygiene. And in this case, I would say that it is not practical to prescribe a set of measures for companies that form all types of shapes and sizes operating in different industries. So in the cybersecurity industry, there has been a shift from a maturity-based approach towards a risk-based approach. What a risk-based approach means is that basically organizations would want to invest based on their risk profile and their risk appetite. So the Cyber Trust Mark framework has a risk assessment process that helps organizations figure out where they are, where their risk profile is in the context of their business, and therefore the corresponding levels that they need to be at. So the Cyber Trust Mark has 5 different tiers, and there are different levels of cybersecurity preparedness domains associated with these tiers. So this is a validity of a 3-year period. And again, an independent assessor from a certification body would come in to assess, both in terms of desktop documentation review, as well as implementation and effectiveness review. The Cyber Trust and the Cyber Essentials Mark are developed in the form of Singapore standards. So the Enterprise Singapore is the government agency that oversees all standards development in Singapore. And there are a set of committees formed to look at different aspects of technology. So this standard was developed out of the Security and Privacy Standards Working Group, where we spun out a working group with industry practitioners representing both users as well as standards professionals, basically to give inputs. And it was formed after 1 year of, and the standards were formed after 1 year of consultation extensively with the industry. So for all of you who are raring to go, just to give you a sense of what this could look like, Cyber Trust is the example that I'm showing here. So the standards are and the documentation is available on our website. But apart from the documentation, we also make available a risk assessment framework for you to take a look at and see how this applies in the context of your organization. So it starts off with a risk assessment process for you to figure out what your inherent risk is, which is basically the risk profile that you face if you didn't put in any cybersecurity measures based on your business profile and basically your business environment. And then after that, if you look at the cybersecurity measures that you put in place, you also then assess your residual risk to figure out whether this is something that's acceptable to you. You want to accept the risk, or do you need to invest further in order to further mitigate the risk? So I think for both sets of risks, there is a guided process and a guided framework, and also heat maps are being generated for you to figure out where you are in your journey. Cybersecurity preparedness assessment is basically the second part of this assessment, and it helps you to look at the measures that you have put in your organization. Together with the risk assessment covered earlier, it'll help you to have a sense of whether you need to put in more, or maybe you have already invested sufficiently. So I think the examples here are basically taken off the spreadsheet. And if you walk through this, you would be able to generate this report for yourself, for your organization. So I think I've very much come to the end of my presentation. I just wanted to recap the key points that Singapore has a big vision to be a leading digital economy in the world and also to be a trusted digital hub. In order for us to do this, I think many of us in the tech industry can actually contribute to this grand vision by demonstrating that we are trusted in the tech industry. And one way to do so is to actually go through cybersecurity certification, because it gives you a visible label to show that you're cyber safe. And CSA has launched Cyber Essentials as well as Cyber Trust certification, which we hope can be beneficial to the tech industry as well. So I think with that, I've come to the end of my presentation. The QR code on this slide basically gives you more details on CSA's website if you wanted to find out more about the standards and the certification that has been developed. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Veronica. That's a lot to unpack. So I have a few questions, if you indulge me a little. So I was intrigued by your reference to the software supply chain, and what we've seen and I think it's very, very apt to describe it as a supply chain, because we assemble technology assets from and capabilities from lots of different building blocks, particularly in the API world. And we've seen in the physical world, organizations look at their supply chains, and many of them audit their supply chain because they want to make sure that they have maintain their great reputation, and that they do what they say they're going to do. So, for example, a company that's selling organic products will go and audit their whole supply chain to make sure that every step along the way they're using organic materials in that. And they'll go out and visit countries where are growing organic crops and find them. And also other things like not using forced labor or child labor, and fair trade. So everything from coffee to chocolate, there are organizations that are checking to see that the producers are actually getting paid a fair amount for their input. When it comes to the software supply chain, we have a range of things, and we've also seen a number of breaches where a supermarket in Sweden discovered that they couldn't use their POS terminals because of some company in the US that they didn't even know about was part of their software supply chain and was a victim of a ransomware attack. So given that we're creating new capabilities out of lots of these building blocks, some of which are proprietary, some of which are open source, some they can come from anywhere in the world, from big suppliers to smaller suppliers. What are some of the steps that organizations should be thinking about as they consider what makes up their supply chain?
I guess firstly is awareness. I personally feel that awareness starts with everything. So I think firstly is being aware about software supply chain or general supply chain issues and how it can impact your cybersecurity posture. The next is probably traditionally inventory management or taking stock of your software suppliers. In many cases, sometimes when you engage into third-party transactions, you may not actually holistically have a view of what are some of your software supply chain partners or your other supply chain partners. So I think next is then to take stock of basically all the different suppliers that you have. And then thirdly would be very much from a risk management perspective, evaluating your partners and having a methodology to make sure that they are cyber safe before you work with them, and if they are not, then what are some of the measures that you want to take in place? In terms of individual individual suppliers, there are some additional things that people talk about. And earlier on, you mentioned looking at the supermarket and the fair trade, for example, as part of the physical goods supply chain. I suppose the equivalent in the industry is basically the software equivalent, where they're looking at bill of material. So I think once you have done the initial steps of being aware, taking stock of your supply chain partners, and making sure that you have a risk assessment process to manage your partners and find a way to make sure that they're cyber safe before you work with them, then specific to each type of supplier, you may want to look into individual components. For example, in the area of software, it could be bill of material. There's also another big industry effort on making sure that your open source software is also secure. And this comes in the form of the Linux Foundation, where they have a group looking at a secure open source software. So I think there are really quite a few different strands to start with and to look at. But essentially, it all starts with awareness and taking action through managing and taking stock of your suppliers. And then the next level of details specific to each supplier.
And I've seen some companies, some software as a service providers, for example, decide to get on the front foot and actually declare who they use for different functions. So Stripe, for example, and then not the only organization, but they, if you look on their website, they will list the different subcontractors that they use for certain processing of certain data. So they have their contact center and the software that is used there and the other components there. So is this a trend that you're starting to see? And how is it possible for consuming organizations to require this of their suppliers? What are sort of the dynamics that are going on in this?
I guess for the larger organizations, because they are relatively larger buyers, what we're starting to see is that they're starting to require and impose some form of requirements on their suppliers. So some of them may have a set of pre-onboarding standards, and they would want to make sure that, for example, the major platform players, before the suppliers come on board and interact with them, some of these standards are in place first. I would say for the smaller buyers and the smaller companies, usually they may not want to take this step simply because as a small buyer, they're usually not in a strong position to make that ask and make that request. But certainly for the larger ones, we would be seeing some of these requirements being put in place. Some of them may have their own standards, others may have other expectations, for example, demonstration to show that you're certified to a certain level or at a certain, at a certain mark with a certain minimum level that you have in place.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, well, I guess what you're getting to is a risk-based approach, as well as I guess the buying power of large organizations as opposed to smaller organizations. Another aspect is where the data resides. Singapore is quite a safe place, and you have really strong standards around protection of data, and this is why some major cloud computing providers make sure that they have data centers here in Singapore. What are some of the aspects around data residency and that you typically see happening?
I guess for where data residency is concerned, I think some of the bigger projects that I've seen, and I think quite consistent with government projects, is that typically we would have there would be a certain expectation of data sovereignty, that perhaps the critical, important, or data would actually reside in Singapore. And since you mentioned data, I thought also important to mention that apart from cybersecurity, very much joined at the hip to cybersecurity is also good data practices. In attacks such as ransomware, for example, you would see that very often, because of the less than stellar cybersecurity or cyber hygiene practices, it results in data leakage. In some cases, it is sensitive data that is sensitive to the organization, proprietary. In others, it's personal data, which is then a breach of personal data regulations. So I think these two are very much joined at the hip. So even as we talk about cybersecurity, I think we should also not forget about the importance of data protection, and particularly in light of personal data protection laws, then PII is important to protect as well.
Yeah, so it's not just what the cybersecurity aspect; it's the it's the privacy protections regulations, which are quite strong in Singapore, but you also see similar protection regulations elsewhere. GDPR is an example from Europe. So if we're a startup and Singapore has quite a thriving startup ecosystem, what are the sorts of steps that a startup should consider as they're starting to pull together these different building blocks, because they really can assemble a great seamless customer experience from lots of different pieces, but what are some of the cautions that we should be considering as we're putting these together, these experiences together?
So this is a great question. I'm making certain assumptions that the startup that we're talking about here, especially in the context of this conference, is that this is a technology startup. So I think usually a technology startup would be already relatively digital. The founders and the owners usually also are very much digital natives. So I think putting in digital technology to basically bootstrap your startup is something that is a given. If that, then I think importantly, as you're running and raring to go to create new opportunities for your startup, is also to make sure that you actually create that reputation for yourself to be cyber safe and secure. So one part is obviously to exploit the opportunities available and to create and really make money from that. But I think in doing so, it's important to think about your reputation and build that reputation from the start for being safe and secure. And that's where we would maybe suggest something like the Cyber Essentials mark, which is a mark of cyber hygiene. It is a relatively lower bar compared to the cyber trust. Don't have to go through an extensive risk assessment framework, but basically a good way for you to get started in demonstrating that you have put in place all the right measures to stay cyber safe. And this would be useful because it gives you a certain recognition. Recognition, I think, is actually quite important, especially for startups. I've met with startups who, in the past of in the course of our industry consultation, we've spoken to startups as well to understand what were some of their key considerations in going for certification. And they said that for many of their cases, they were a new player, a young player operating in a fairly established or mature industry. And in some cases, I think many of the startup founders were also reasonably young. So if you walk into a business meeting, you find that as a startup owner, you could be reasonably young, and your counterparts in the room are all, well, definitely much more mature. So then how do you actually create that impression that you're here to stay, you're serious about your business, and actually you do have good credentials? So I think one way is by demonstrating that you have gone through the rigorous certification process, and therefore you're serious about business. And when you attain the certification, basically it shows that you have met a minimum level, you're here to stay. This is obviously not the only way for you to demonstrate it, but I think if you put a few things together, firstly, a great business idea, the ability to be agile and run very quickly, and thirdly, a key consideration on reputation, on building up that trust with your customer, and basically showing that you're cyber safe. These would be three great ways, I think, for you to get started. And I think very importantly for startups, building up that initial trust and that reputation is important, because you do want to build that relationship or trust with your initial few customers and your investors, so that they have the confidence in you that you're here to stay and you're not going to maybe disappear in 6 months' time.
Yeah. And in regard to the risk-based approach, so there are a lot of fintech startups in Singapore, and the Monetary Authority of Singapore and the Singapore Fintech Association have constructed a certification framework which includes some aspects of cybersecurity and the protection of data. How do you see that tying in with your broader remit of cybersecurity in Singapore?
Well, I think firstly is that cybersecurity is a team sport. It's not something that any one party can do alone. So I think if different government agencies, different associations actually have a role to play in upping the cybersecurity posture. So I think for us, we look at it very much from a macro national level across all organizations, large and small. And we think that it's great that there are actually players focusing very much in the financial sector, in the financial industry. So early on, if you look at one of my slides where we considered the differences between the two certifications we want to go for, I also mentioned that sometimes it depends on the industry that you are operating in, or if you're a tech supplier, the industry that you're supplying to. So I think for the regulated industries, and the financial sector is definitely one of the regulated industries, the stakes are higher. So when things get disrupted in a breach, for example, the stakes are definitely higher. And this is where generally you would find that a lot more people would pay attention to cybersecurity in that specific industry. So yes, the banks may be regulated because they are holding important, critical, essential services and offering it to the nation. But even though you may not be a bank, but basically still operating in the financial sector, because the overall industry has a certain minimum expectation and a certain posture, I think you would also, as part of the industry, need to also up yourself so that you are sort of on par with the rest and being able to then compete in that arena, especially if you're supplying to, let's say, a bank or a company that has a very strong cybersecurity posture and a strong cybersecurity maturity and a certain expectation of what you need to be able to do.
Yeah, I think that gets back to your earlier comment about taking a risk-based approach, and anything to do with people's money is a higher risk than some other areas. And as you mentioned, even if it's a small fintech, if it's a critical part of that supply chain in financial services, then it needs to be very rigorous in its cybersecurity capability, and to make sure that it is not the weakest link in the chain. And probably all the financial institutions that may be interested in partnering with that fintech would want assurances that it is safe and it is not the weakest link in the chain. So I appreciate that comment. So do you have any sort of we talked about what startups should do and fintechs should do. what do you see as the opportunities for cybersecurity specialists in this area, and what sort of either career opportunities or opportunities for providers do you see in helping to shape this safer environment that we're creating in Singapore?
So this is an interesting question because I think globally we are seeing a shortage in cybersecurity specialists, and this is not just the case in Singapore. So I think for I would say the opportunities are definitely immense for the cybersecurity specialist who already is in the field and has the skill set. Simply because there's a huge shortage and everyone is hiring. Maybe I wanted to cover this from the perspective of the technology specialist who's not yet in cybersecurity. I've actually realized that it's actually very possible and very doable to actually pivot into the cybersecurity sector, or to do what you're currently doing, but take a very strong interest and build that adjacent skill in cybersecurity. Essentially, if you think about cybersecurity, you can think about it as a vertical, but it's also a horizontal in the sense that it's always applied in the context of something. So cybersecurity in the context of, let's say, the banking sector, which is a specific domain. Cybersecurity from the perspective of emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, blockchain, and even things like space technologies. As any of these new technologies come about and evolve, there's always a need for cybersecurity, and sometimes the application of the classic cybersecurity principles need to be adapted and adjusted for that new technology area, or in the context of the domain, that specific domain. So I think the opportunities are huge for many of the room who are IT professionals who are in the digital space looking into technology. I think there's definitely an opportunity to build that parallel or the second skill set to complement your current skill set today in technology.
Yeah, I think any time you build something that becomes more valuable, unfortunately, it becomes a target for somebody. So at the same time as you're trying to create, you also need to be protecting. So I think that's a great insight. Well, thank you very much, Veronica. There's some great insights there, and I encourage everyone in the audience to find out more about cybersecurity in general, and particularly the initiatives that Cybersecurity Agency Singapore is undertaking to help keep us all safe. Thanks very much, Veronica.
Thank you.